A retired Navy SEAL walks into a hospital room to visit his dying father, and on the old man's shoulder, he sees it, the trident, the same eagle, anchor, and flintlock pistol that only SEALs earn. But his father was a mechanic who never served a day in uniform. Or so he thought. Before you find out what happens next, if you love your mom and dad, hit that subscribe button and show them some love. They deserve it. Commander Jake Morrison had seen death in every form imaginable. He had watched brothers fall in desert firefights, held dying men in flooded tunnels, and carried body bags through mountain passes where the air was too thin to breathe properly. 23 years as a Navy SEAL had carved him into something harder than the men who grew up in the same Pennsylvania steel town, the ones who worked the mills until their backs gave out and their lungs filled with dust. But nothing in those 2 decades of warfare had prepared him for the phone call that came on a Tuesday morning while he was running drills with his team in Virginia Beach. His father was dying. Lung cancer, stage 4, and the doctors gave him weeks, maybe days. Jake caught the first flight to Pittsburgh, still wearing his workout clothes, his mind racing through memories that felt both distant and immediate. Thomas Morrison had been a constant in Jake's life, the kind of father who showed up to every baseball game, who taught him to change oil and throw a punch, who never missed a birthday even when money was tight. He had worked at Henderson's auto shop for 40 years, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his laugh loud enough to fill their small house on Maple Street. He was ordinary in a way that good men often are, unremarkable to everyone except the people who loved him. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something sweet and rotten that Jake recognized as the smell of a body shutting down. His mother sat in a chair by the window, her face gray with exhaustion. She had aged a decade in the months since Jake's last visit. His sister Rebecca stood when he entered, and they embraced without words. Their father lay in the bed, diminished, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. The man who had once lifted engine blocks and carried Jake on his shoulders now looked like he weighed nothing at all. Jake pulled a chair close and took his father's hand. The old man's eyes fluttered open, struggled to focus, then found Jake's face. A smile, weak but genuine, crossed his lips. They talked in fragments, the way people do when words cost too much energy. His father asked about the team, about Virginia Beach, about whether Jake was eating enough. Normal questions from a normal father. Then, as a nurse came in to adjust his medications and check his vitals, Jake's father shifted in the bed, and his hospital gown slipped down his shoulder. Jake's breath caught in his throat. There, faded and stretched over wasted muscle, was a tattoo. The SEAL trident, the eagle with its fierce expression, clutching a flintlock pistol in one talon and an anchor in the other, the whole design overlaid with a trident that cut upward through the center. Jake knew that tattoo. He had the same one on his own shoulder, earned after Hell Week, after proving himself worthy of the Brotherhood. Every man who wore it had paid for it in blood and suffering. You didn't fake a SEAL trident. You didn't get on a whim in some tattoo parlor. It meant something. Jake stared at the tattoo, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. His father had been a mechanic. He had never served in the military. He had stayed in their small town his entire life, working at the same shop, coming home to the same house, living a quiet life of routine and simplicity. There had been no service, no deployments, no stories of military glory. Jake had been the first Morrison to join the armed forces, a decision that surprised everyone who knew the family. His father's eyes opened again, and he saw where Jake was looking. Something passed across the old man's face, a kind of recognition mixed with resignation. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. Jake leaned closer. "I need to tell you something," his father managed, "before it's too late, about who I really was." Over the next hour, in a voice that kept fading and returning, Thomas Morrison told a story that Jake had never heard. He had been young, barely 20, when he joined the Navy in 1965. Vietnam was escalating, and Thomas had grown up poor in West Virginia, the son of a coal miner who died of black lung before Thomas turned 16. The military offered escape, purpose, money for his mother. He enlisted and found that he was good at it, better than he expected. When recruiters came looking for volunteers for something new, something dangerous, he raised his hand. They called it SEAL Team 2. The program was experimental, brutal, designed to create warriors who could operate in any environment, who could do the impossible. Thomas made it through training. He earned the Trident in 1967 and deployed to the Mekong Delta 3 months later. He spent 2 years in Vietnam, running operations that would remain classified for decades, missions that involved infiltrating enemy positions, capturing high-value targets, surviving in conditions that killed tougher men. He saw things that carved pieces out of the soul. He did things that he knew he would never be able to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. When his enlistment ended in 1969, he came home to a country that hated its soldiers, to a world where his service was something to hide rather than honor. He never talked about it. He changed his name slightly, moved to Pennsylvania, found work as a mechanic, and buried everything about those years. He met Jake's mother in 1972, and when she asked about his past, he told her he had worked odd jobs after high school. He never corrected the assumption that he had never served. The Trident tattoo stayed hidden under work shirts and jackets. He built a new life, a simple life, as far from war as he could manage. He had 2 children and never told them that their father had been one of the deadliest men in the most elite military unit in the world. Jake sat in stunned silence as his father's voice finally gave out. The nurse returned and insisted that Thomas needed rest. Jake walked out of the room in a daze, his sister and mother following. In the hallway, he turned to his mother. "Did you know?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I found the tattoo years ago. He told me it was from a mistake he made when he was young, that he got drunk and woke up with it. I believed him. I never questioned it." Jake's mind was reeling. His father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike and balance a checkbook, had been a SEAL before Jake was even born. The quiet mechanic who read the newspaper every morning and fell asleep watching baseball had run classified operations in one of the most dangerous conflicts in American history. Every assumption Jake had made about his life, about being the first in his family to serve, about breaking new ground, was wrong. He called his team leader that night from a hotel. Commander Richards listened as Jake explained the situation, the discovery, the impossible revelation. There was a long pause on the line. "What was your father's full name and approximate dates of service?" Richards asked. Jake provided the information. Richards said he would make some calls. 2 days later, Jake returned to the hospital. His father was weaker, barely conscious, but Jake needed answers. He needed to understand. As he sat by the bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Richards. It contained a single attachment, a declassified file, heavily redacted but readable. Jake opened it and began to scroll. Thomas Morrison, it turned out, had not just been a SEAL. He had been one of the best. His file listed 17 confirmed missions, most of them deep reconnaissance and direct action operations that had saved countless lives. He had earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and a Purple Heart, all of which had been processed but never publicly awarded at his request. There were commendations from officers Jake recognized, legends in the SEAL community, men he had studied and admired. One notation mentioned that Petty Officer Morrison had declined advancement and officer training multiple times, preferring to remain operational. Another noted that he had voluntarily left the service despite being encouraged to stay, citing personal reasons. The file included one photograph, grainy and black and white, showing a group of SEALs in 1968. Jake zoomed in on the faces. There, young and lean and hard-eyed, was his father. He stood among men Jake had read about, warriors whose exploits had become the foundation of SEAL training and doctrine. His father's expression in the photo was familiar, the same slight smile he wore in family pictures, but his eyes were different. They held something Jake recognized because he saw it in the mirror after his own deployments. The look of someone who had seen too much and survived. Jake forwarded the file to his team. Within an hour, his phone started ringing. First Richards, then other members of the command, then SEALs from different teams who had heard the story. Word spread to the community, the way it always did when something important emerged. By evening, Jake's phone was overwhelmed with messages. Old veterans who had served in Vietnam reached out, some who had known Thomas, others who simply wanted to acknowledge one of their own. The SEAL community, for all its secrecy and exclusivity, never forgot its members. 3 days later, Jake's father took a turn for the worse. The family gathered, knowing the end was close. Jake sat by the bed, holding his father's hand, and leaned in close. "I know who you were," Jake whispered. "I know what you did, and I understand why you stayed quiet." His father's eyes opened one last time. He squeezed Jake's hand with surprising strength. "I'm proud of you," Thomas whispered. "I saw what you became, and I was proud. You earned it yourself. That was important to me. I never wanted you to do it because of me. I wanted you to find your own reasons." Jake felt tears on his face, something that rarely happened anymore. "You could have told me. It would have meant everything." Thomas shook his head slightly. "You didn't need my war. You had your own. That's how it should be. Every man has to find his own path. I didn't want you carrying my ghosts." Those were the last coherent words Thomas Morrison spoke. He slipped into unconsciousness that night and died 2 days later, with his family around him, in the early morning hours when the hospital was quiet and the world outside was just beginning to wake. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a small chapel in their hometown. Jake expected maybe 50 people, family and friends, the usual gathering of people who had known his father as a mechanic and neighbor. When he arrived at the chapel that morning, he stopped in shock. The parking lot was full. Cars lined the street for blocks. And standing outside the entrance, in their dress uniforms, were 5 men Jake recognized immediately. They were SEALs from his own command, men he had served with, including Commander Richards. But they were not alone. Scattered through the crowd were dozens of other men, some elderly, some middle-aged, all standing with the unmistakable bearing of military personnel. As Jake approached, Richards stepped forward. "Word got out," Richards said simply, "about your father, about who he was. They wanted to come." Jake walked into the chapel in a daze. The pews were filled. Many of the faces were unfamiliar, but Jake could identify them by type. Vietnam veterans, men who had served in SEAL teams across different decades, active duty personnel who had driven or flown from bases across the country. In the front row, wearing dress blues despite being in his 80s, sat a man Jake recognized from photographs in the SEAL Museum. Command Master Chief Daniel Harkness, a living legend who had helped shape modern special operations. He stood when Jake entered and offered a nod of respect. The service was simple, as Thomas would have wanted. The pastor spoke about a good man, a faithful husband, a loving father. Jake's sisters shared memories of their childhood, of camping trips and birthday parties, and the small moments that made up a life. Then Richard stood and walked to the front. "Most of you knew Thomas Morrison as a mechanic, a neighbor, a friend," Richard began. "Some of us knew him differently. We knew him as Petty Officer Morrison, SEAL Team 2, a warrior who served his country with distinction and honor. He carried his service quietly, without seeking recognition or glory. That was his choice, and we respect it. But today, we want to acknowledge what he did, what he sacrificed, and what he represented. He was one of us. He will always be one of us." Richards placed a folded American flag on the coffin, the same flag that would normally be presented to the family of a fallen veteran. Then, one by one, 5 SEALs approached the coffin. They were not just Jake's teammates. They represented 5 different eras of SEAL operations: Vietnam, Grenada, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each placed a hand on the coffin for a moment, a gesture of respect and brotherhood that transcended time and circumstance. The silence in the chapel was absolute after the service. As people filed out to the cemetery, Jake stood by the coffin, alone for a moment. He placed his own hand on the polished wood. "I get it now," he said quietly. "Why you stayed silent. Why you built a different life. You wanted peace. You earned it." At the cemetery, as Thomas Morrison was laid to rest, a Navy honor guard performed a 3-volley salute, the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the hills. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes carrying on the wind. The flag from the coffin was folded with precision and presented to Jake's mother, who clutched it to her chest and wept. And around the grave, standing in quiet formation, were more than 60 men who wore or had worn the trident, all of them there to honor one of their own. After everyone else had left, Jake remained at the graveside with his 5 teammates. They stood together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Chief Petty Officer Mike Dorsey, the youngest of the group, spoke. "My grandfather served in Korea," Dorsey said. "Never talked about it either. Came home and worked construction for 40 years. I didn't know he had a Silver Star until we found it in a box after he died." The others nodded. They all had similar stories of fathers or uncles or grandfathers who had served and stayed silent, who had carried their wars privately and built quiet lives in the aftermath. It was a pattern older than the country itself. Warriors who came home and chose peace over glory, who let their service fade into the background of ordinary life. Lieutenant James Chun, who had deployed with Jake to Afghanistan, looked at the headstone. He must have been proud of you, watching you become a SEAL, knowing what it took, what it meant. He understood everything you went through without being able to tell you he had gone through it too. Jake thought about that, about his father sitting in the audience at his graduation from BUD/S training, about the quiet conversations they had had over the years when Jake came home on leave. There had been moments when his father had asked questions that seemed oddly specific, that suggested a deeper understanding of military life than a civilian should have. Jake had dismissed them at the time, assuming his father had learned from movies or books. Now he understood. His father had been watching him walk a path he knew intimately, unable to offer guidance or share experiences, letting Jake find his own way. "He gave me the greatest gift," Jake said. "He let me earn it myself. He never made it about him. I became a SEAL because I wanted it, because I worked for it, not because I was following in anyone's footsteps. He stayed quiet so I could find my own reasons." Master Chief Petty Officer Ray Sullivan, the oldest of the group at 53, had served in Desert Storm and had seen combat across 3 decades. He put a hand on Jake's shoulder. That generation understood something we're still learning, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is put down the gun and walk away. Your father fought his war, did his duty, and then chose to live. Really live. He didn't let the war define him. That takes a different kind of courage. They stood together as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Jake thought about his father's life, about the duality of it, the secret history that had run beneath the surface of the ordinary. Thomas Morrison had been 2 men, or perhaps he had been one man who contained multitudes. He had been a warrior and a father, a killer and a healer, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to build something good anyway. In the days after the funeral, Jake returned to Virginia Beach and his team, but something had shifted. He found himself thinking differently about his future, about what came after the deployments ended, after his body aged out of frontline service. He had always assumed he would stay in until they forced him out, that the SEAL teams were his entire identity. Now he understood there could be something beyond it, that leaving the battlefield did not mean abandoning who you were. Months later, Jake was in his apartment going through boxes of his father's belongings that his mother had sent. Among the tools and old photographs, he found a small journal, leather-bound and worn. Inside, in his father's careful handwriting, were entries dating from 1967 to 1969. They were brief, cryptic, clearly written in violation of operational security protocols, but apparently never discovered or reported. They described missions in sparse detail, emotions in fragments. One entry, dated December 1968, caught Jake's attention. "Extracted a pilot today," it read. "He was alive because we got there in time. His family will never know how close it was. They will never know our names. That is how it should be. We do not do this for recognition. We do this because someone has to, and we are the ones who can." Jake closed the journal and sat in silence. His father had understood the essential truth of their profession, that the greatest operations were the ones no one ever heard about, that the truest service was anonymous, that the reward was not glory but the knowledge that you had done something that mattered. He thought about the 5 SEALs who had stood with him at the funeral, about the 60 men who had come to honor someone most of them had never met, about the unbroken chain of warriors that stretched back through generations. The trident his father had worn was the same one Jake wore. The values his father had lived by were the ones Jake had sworn to uphold. The silence his father had maintained was not about shame or secrecy, but about dignity and choice. Jake returned to duty with a new understanding. He trained harder, led better, carried himself with the knowledge that what he was doing was part of something larger than himself. And when people asked him why he served, why he kept deploying into danger when he had done enough to retire with honor, he thought of his father and gave the simplest answer: because someone has to, and I am someone who can. Years later, when Jake finally retired from active duty and returned to Pennsylvania, he visited his father's grave regularly. He would sit by the headstone and talk, sharing stories from his deployments, telling his father about the men he had served with, the missions they had run, the lives they had saved. And though his father could not respond, Jake felt the connection between them, the understanding that transcended death and time. They were both warriors. They had both chosen to serve, and they had both found their way home. The tattoo on Jake's shoulder remained, identical to the one his father had worn, but now it meant something different. It was not just a mark of his own service, but a link to his father, a shared symbol of the price they had both paid and the brotherhood they had both joined. When younger SEALs asked Jake about his family, about where he came from, he told them the truth. His father had been a mechanic who worked his entire life in a small town in Pennsylvania. His father had also been a Navy SEAL who ran classified operations in Vietnam and earned the respect of legends. Both things were true. Both things defined the man Thomas Morrison had been. And in the end, that was a lesson Jake carried forward. That people were more than they appeared, that quiet lives could contain extraordinary chapters, and that the greatest strength was sometimes found in the choice to lay down your weapons and build something good. His father had been a warrior and a father, a legend and an ordinary man. And in being both, he had shown Jake what it meant to truly serve. Not just your country, but your family, your community, and the values that made all of it worthwhile. The trident his father had earned in 1967 and kept hidden for decades had finally been revealed. And in that revelation, Jake had discovered not just his father's past, but his own future. The understanding that service did not end when uniform came off, that brotherhood transcended time, and that the most important battles were often the ones fought in silence, for reasons that needed no explanation to anyone except yourself. That tattoo, the SEAL trident his father had carried in secret for 50 years, had changed everything. It had revealed a history Jake never knew existed and rewritten the story of his own life. And as Jake moved forward, building his own life after service, he carried both his own trident and his father's legacy, two weights that balance each other, two truths that made him whole. So viewers, we want to hear from you. What part of the country are you watching this video from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. We love hearing from patriots all across this great nation, from California to Maine, from Texas to Alaska. Let us know where you are and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Honor the quiet heroes in your own life. They are all around us, waiting to be seen.